Well, the word war on terror is total nonsense. It's utter, complete, total nonsense. It's like, when you say there's a humanitarian intervention, that's also one of these words, which is a total nonsense word. I mean, okay, yes, you read these words in the newspaper, you hear them on television, and you have politicians talking about it. You have prime ministers, defense ministers, professors, what have you. But forget it. I mean, the war on terror is nonsense. It doesn't work. I mean, what does it mean? I mean, war on terror, does that mean you use violence, because war is violence, to destroy violence? Because terror is violence. It basically means violence on violence. Okay? So if somebody tells you, I'm now explaining you violence on violence, then you're going to say, is that fire on fire? What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. It is just propaganda. It is just propaganda for people to justify wars of aggression. We call them war of aggression. I mean, take the concrete example, 2003, US President Bush, together with British Prime Minister Tony Blair, attacked Iraq in 2003. And that was illegal. You can't attack another country because you have the UN Charter from 1945, and it says every country on the world, and we are 200 countries on the world, must stick to the Charter of the United Nations. And in that charter, it says very explicitly, you cannot bomb another country. Okay? It's illegal. You can't do it. Now, the British and the Americans, they just didn't care. They said, well, whatever there is in the UN Charter, we're going to bomb Iraq. But how are we going to convince the public? And they said, we have to do this because Saddam Hussein poses a huge threat. He has weapons of mass destruction, and he's going to give these weapons of mass destructions to the terrorists. And the terrorists will then carry out a biological, chemical attack on the United States or on London. So people in the US and in Great Britain were totally scared. Not everybody, but a lot of people, because they had heard this talk, war, terror, and then they were just scared.
Saddam Hussein is a homicidal dictator who is addicted to weapons of mass destruction. And we know that Iraq is continuing to finance terror and gives assistance to groups that use terrorism to undermine Middle East peace.
And in the end, the American soldiers who were fighting in Iraq and were shooting Iraqis, they believed, and that is totally insane, but they believed that they were there because Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, with the terrorist attacks on 9/11. This is total confusion. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it. But there are polls, among American soldiers, and some 80% said they're there because of 9/11. Now, that means that the war on terror is just something to confuse those who allow themselves to be confused. But if you're smart enough, and if you're awake, you understand that this war on terror is total nonsense. And, the most recent example is now happening in May 2017. US President Donald Trump, the new president, the first country he visits on the whole earth is Saudi Arabia. Okay, I mean, fair enough. He can choose whatever country he wants to visit. But then what he does, he visits the king of Saudi Arabia. His name is Salman. He's not very well known. Okay, Salman is a very powerful man. He's the king of Saudi Arabia. And the two men, Trump and Salman, agree on military deals worth $100 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, Saudi Arabia has sponsored radical Sunni terrorism for many years. So if you look back to history, the Saudis sent young men to Afghanistan between 1979 and 1988. So that was the creation of Al-Qaeda. In fact, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi. So it's really very strange if President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia to sell a lot of weapons, a really huge amount of weapons, and says, all this is important because we have this war on terrorism. So to sum it up, forget it. The war on terrorism, that's for dummies. word terrorism is being used today too much. Okay, it's being used everywhere, every day, on every TV channel, in every newspaper, online, everywhere. If you have violence, you know, people very quickly speak of terrorism. And the reason is that there are groups who are interested that this word is being used very often, because then they can justify more military spending. So if you have the word terrorism, let's say, 10 times a day in your country on the radio, and, you know, a few weeks later, the defense minister says, we need more guns. And people say, why? What's the threat? He's going to say terrorism. And imagine you had never heard of terrorism before. You're going to say, you don't get more money, forget it. But if you hear that word every day or 10 times a day, you're going to say, yeah, sure. How much money do you want? 1 billion, 2 billion, 10 billion. And the same is true for the surveillance states. We now have a process where people who are in power want to watch everybody and everything. Okay, they want to track your iPhone. They want to track every smartphone. They want to monitor what you watch on the internet, on YouTube. They just want to track you. They want to find out where you spend your money and where you park your car, whether you're ill or whether you're healthy. And then people go like, oh, no, I don't like that. Why do you want to watch my phone? And then people say, because terrorism. So really it's become something of a buzzword, terrorism, and it has nothing to do with really helping the issue. It's basically a word to scare everybody and keep people jumping all around. And it all started with basically 9/11. So in 2001, the word terrorism came up big time. Ever since, it's been all over the place. For 16 years, this is the case. And I personally have researched terrorism in the Cold War, Operation Gladio, and other questions. And I just remember that in the late 1990s, people asked me, so what is your PhD? Because it was my PhD research. So what are you researching? I'm saying, I'm researching terrorism and NATO secret armies. And then my friends, that was at the LSE in London, they said, terrorism. Oh, gee, that's really boring. I mean, that's a long time ago. That's the Rote Armee-Fraktion in Germany in the 70s. But that's way gone. Or do you look at Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace, but that's in the 80s. This is really, forget it. Why don't you research globalization? It's really funny how things change.